All right, hey everyone. This is Benji, Dallas Jewish Conservatives. Hope everyone is doing well in their quarantines, staying happy, staying healthy. Really appreciate you guys taking some time out of your schedule to listen to some incredible people. We have an amazing panel for you today, talking about Israeli politics, Passover, and the current state of the Holy Land. With us today, we have three amazing individuals. We have Gidon Ariel, Jeremy Saltan, and Fleur Hassan-Nahoum. And without further ado, I'm going to start the program here. For those who don't know me, I'm the founder and president of Dallas Jewish Conservatives.
Hello.
I was just actually in Israel not too long ago where I got engaged. Thank you very much. Thank you. And it was just an amazing experience. Had a total new appreciation for the land, and there I was at the Kotel, which was probably one of the most amazing views I'd ever seen in my life. Seeing all the different quarters there from one place, and then we're at the Mamila Hotel where I did the deed, where I proposed. So it was really nice, and need to get back to Israel soon. For those who are not members yet, definitely go to DallasJewishConservatives.com. You can subscribe, become a member, see all of our different events we have coming up. We're obviously going to be doing a lot of virtual events until this whole spiel is over, for lack of a better term. And hopefully we can all come together and see each other in person as well, not just virtual. And for those who are, just want to say, for those who are ill, for those who are sick, and of course those who have already tragically passed away to the coronavirus, our thoughts and our prayers go out to everybody. This is a difficult time for a lot of people, and again, we really appreciate you joining us today. So without further ado, we'll get started. Just a couple of quick notes. Everyone's on mute currently, but if you have a question, just raise your virtual hand. You should see a virtual hand button as one of the options on your screen. Or if you're not comfortable with asking it live, you can just type your question in the chat. Either way is fine with me, and you can ask one of the panelists or all the panelists a question. It's up to you. So just want to throw that out there. And we'll also have Q&A at the end, but at any point, feel free to ask a question. Today's featured speakers. So we have Jeremy Saltan, who's the Israeli Defense Minister, advisor to Naftali Bennett and the Knesset Insider. My dear friend, Gidon Ariel, many of you in Dallas, they're on the Zoom meeting today and on Facebook Live have seen him before. He's the founder of Root Source, and he's a Likud party member as well. And then finally, Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, who's the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I want to open it up with Jeremy Saltan. A little bit about Jeremy. He's a Knesset insider, political strategist, leading political analyst, campaigner, municipality politician, and one of Israel's top poll analysts. Jeremy is a longstanding advisor of Naftali Bennett, as I mentioned, and Israel's current defense minister, and he's a central figure of the Yamina list. Take it away, Jeremy. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Benji. I want to start out by thanking Benji, of course, everybody at the Dallas Jewish Conservatives, of course, the other members of this distinguished panel, which I'm very honored to be a part of. What I'm going to do for the next 20 minutes is I'm going to go ahead and sort of explain how it is that we ended up where we are right now in terms of the current situation of Israeli politics. It's been a year plus to get us to this point. I'll talk a little bit about what's going on right now and also talk about what's expected in terms of the months ahead. So unlike America, where you guys have fixed terms in which you know when you're going to have an election, right? For you guys, you know that you're going to have an election in November. And besides, of course, president, if it's on the rotating years, so you'll be voting for Senate. Of course, every 2 years you're voting for your Congress. And you have a lot of other things that are, as we know, is called down the ballot for a bunch of other issues. Here in Israel, we do not have that, unfortunately. And we don't necessarily know when we're going to have an election. We know when the last date is, when it's possible that we might have an election. So the 20th Knesset, which was inaugurated in 2015, we knew that the election would be sometime before November of 2019. We didn't know exactly when, but we knew that it would come up at some point before that date. Now, unfortunately, we had a situation where, despite having a very strong right-wing government, we had a guy by the name of Avigdor Lieberman, who was defense minister at the time, who was previously a member of the right-wing bloc that was part of a number of Netanyahu governments going back to 2009, when Netanyahu returned to become prime minister of Israel. And there were a few fights and there were a few breaks in the middle, but for the most part, Lieberman was a member of all of those governments, whether it was for the whole term or part of the term. The first two, he was foreign minister, and that one, he was defense minister. He decided to leave. That left Israel in a very, very small majority. Unlike in the United States, where you could have a situation in which, for instance, you had President Obama, who had to deal with Republicans in Congress, either in one or in both houses. Here in Israel, because we're a parliamentary democracy, you must have the confidence of the Knesset in order to be able to be prime minister. So with Lieberman leaving, we had a very, very narrow right-wing majority of 61-59. And with that small majority, we were able to sort of limp around. If Lieberman left the coalition in October of 2018, we're able to bring it down into December of 2018. And then when you're in this situation, which happens a lot of times, I'm sure you've noticed this in a lot of votes within the US Senate, when you have a very, very narrow majority, every vote counts. Suddenly you'll have a couple, 2 or 3 senators get together and they'll say that they want certain things, special agendas, and it becomes very difficult to govern. We knew that anyways, we were gonna go into 2019 as an election year. So we made the decision to go ahead and just bring up the election. And instead of it being in November of 2019, we had it in April of 2019. So we had a normal election cycle as you usually have it, except we ended up at the end of that with a 60-60 tie, where 60 seats were supporting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition of parties that support him, and 60 seats that ended up opposing him. Now, one of the things that happened, which was something that was unprecedented, was that the Joint Arab List decided to go ahead and support the Benny Gantz, who was the leader of the opposition parties that were trying to bring a center-left government to the state of Israel. However, Avigdor Lieberman, who was that key figure who was a part of the right-wing bloc, decided not to support either side. By not supporting either side and us being stuck in a 60-60 stalemate, that ended up sending Israel into a second election because we were not able to form a government. Now, one of the things that makes the Israeli system different than other systems are that in order to go ahead and figure out who your prime minister is, to elect a prime minister, you actually have to go through 3 separate votes. The first vote is the vote that all of the citizens take part in, and that's the Knesset elections. The second vote is a vote that takes place at the president's residence. The president, unlike the president of the United States and in other presidential systems, the president in a prime minister system is a person who's more of a figurehead who has very, very little in terms of authority and responsibilities. But one of the main jobs the president has is that each list which is elected into the Israeli parliament needs to go ahead and go to the president's residence and nominate a candidate for prime minister. So in this second vote, like I said, in our first election, we ended up with a 60, you actually had 65 nominations, because in the beginning, Lieberman decided that he was going to nominate Netanyahu, but he did not end up going ahead and moving forward and actually supporting the coalition, which brings us to the third vote. If the first vote is everybody, which is the citizens voting for the Knesset, the second vote is in the president's residence. The third vote is in the Knesset itself, in which each one of the 120 MKs gets a chance to vote confidence for the government that is supposed to be able to govern Israel. And until this point, we've not yet got there. So if Lieberman in the first election nominated Netanyahu and sort of pretended to be part of the right-wing bloc, he did not sign any coalition agreements, which put us in a situation where we could not go ahead and form a government. So we ended up in a situation of a second election, which is something that had never happened in Israel, to have two elections in the same year. During that election, we found ourselves in a place where, unfortunately, the right-wing bloc went ahead. The conservative bloc dropped to 55 seats. We had 60 before. We had 55 in the second election. And as a result of having less, we were in danger, of course, of seeing a left-wing government in Israel. But what happened was this Lieberman character, who had nominated Netanyahu for prime minister in the first election. In the second election, he decided not to nominate Netanyahu or Benny Gantz, and he decided to nominate nobody. By nominating nobody, what happened was that neither side was able to form a majority. And what happened was that all of the attempts to try to form a government failed. Now, there's a lot of little details in terms of how it is that you form a government. But basically, to make it as simple as possible, what happens is the first person who is able to get the most votes at the president's residence, he goes ahead and tries first. He has a maximum of 42 days to do so. Afterwards, if he succeeds, we go ahead and have a situation where we have the third vote, which I talked about. If he's not able to, so then a second person gets a chance. If the second person doesn't get a chance, so then we have a period of 21 days where you could try to have a third candidate or one of the previous two candidates get a majority of signatures in order to go ahead and try again. If you didn't get that, specific point, like I said, it's okay. It's a little bit complicated. But the main point was that after the second election, because Lieberman did not choose either side, we ended up in a crazy situation of having a third election within the same calendar year. Now, in this third election, the right bloc, and in this point, I'll talk a little bit more about the parties. There were 8 lists that were elected to Knesset. If in America, you have the two parties, here we have 8. You had 4 on Netanyahu's side, and you had 4 that were against Netanyahu. The 4 parties of Netanyahu's bloc are Likud, which he leads, Yamina, which is led by Naftali Bennett, who's the head of the Yamina party, and then you have the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties of Shas and UTJ. Together, we ended up with 58 seats in the third election. In terms of the other 4, so you had the Joint Arab List, you had the coalition of the left-wing parties of Labor, Meretz, Gesher, and then besides them, you also had Blue and White, which was led by Benny Gantz, which was a combination of another 3 parties, which are considered more center-left. And then you had Avigdor Lieberman, who was previously on the right-wing bloc, but had put himself as a sort of a spoiler. A lot of people in the press like to call him a kingmaker, but a kingmaker actually chooses a side. He, at that point, was still a spoiler. So we got to the second vote, which is by the president's residence. And in that second vote, Netanyahu got 58, but this time Gantz got 62. If Lieberman in the first election in the president's residence voted for Netanyahu, in the second time he did not vote for anyone. Already in the third one, he had moved completely over and he voted with Benny Gantz. Because 62 is more than 58, Benny Gantz, unlike Netanyahu, who the previous 2 times got a chance to have the first opportunity to be able to form a government, Benny Gantz was given a chance now in this third election to be able to go ahead and form a government. And that takes us pretty much to where we're about to be today, where it was about a week ago that we had this very interesting situation. If you want, I can talk a little bit more about exactly what happened behind the scenes. But overall, what happened was Benny Gantz made a decision to dismantle blue and white. And even though he was the candidate of the opposition, it was very clear to him that it was impossible to take the 62 members of Knesset that comprise the opposition and form a government from them, because on one side, again, you're looking at Avigdor Lieberman, who has a past as a right-winger, and then you have the Joint Arab List, which includes the Communist Party. So to try to have, you know, former nationalist and communist in the same government, that's very difficult to do so. So what Benny Gantz decided to do was to take his party out of the blue and white alliance. And what he's been doing, even though right now he has the mandate to be able to form his own government, is he's looking to go ahead and join a Netanyahu-led government. So where we are today, if we're going to go ahead and summarize quickly what happened. We had 3 elections, which led us to the point where the leader of the opposition of the last 3 elections to Benjamin Netanyahu is now negotiating to join Netanyahu's government. He will try to take this government and move us, unfortunately, further away from the right, because again, he's not a member of the right-wing bloc. He's going to try to go ahead and bring us towards a lot of policies that, for instance, myself in Yamina, I'm not so happy about. But one thing I can tell you that most Israelis are happy about is that we are going to have a government. If we look at the polls that have been conducted since the split in blue and white, where Gantz has now tried, as I said, to try to join the Netanyahu government, you're looking at a situation where, depending on the poll, roughly 2/3 of Israelis support the parties that are expected to be part of this next coalition process. In terms of what's going to happen from now till we actually have a government, unfortunately, this process could drag out as far as July if every single stop on the list of each mandate takes the maximum amount of time. I don't think that it will. Most likely we will have some sort of resolution at some point in April, probably after the Passover holiday. But expectations that we will have a government this week or next week, anyone who has those type of expectations, I don't think we will actually see that. But you know, during this process where you have these coalition negotiations, so that you're able to get to that 3rd and final vote, which is, as I said, a confidence motion in which we see a majority of the Knesset members support the government, we still have a lot more room that needs to be made in terms of the agreement between, you know, this block of 4 right-wing parties that have worked together and for the most part have been in the same government over the last decade. UTJ and Shas were not in the government from 2013 to 2015.
It's frozen.
Benji, take over.
At some point, probably later this month, but at some point before July, we will be able to actually have a new government. And again, I won't be able to tell you exactly when the next Knesset election will be, but hopefully the next Knesset election will be out there in 2024, and we won't repeat this crazy situation of having 3 elections within the last calendar year. So now that I've gone ahead and explained sort of where we've been, where we are now, and where we're headed, I'm happy to take any questions, whether anyone wants to come up or write in the chat. Looking forward.
Thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate it. Anyone feel free to put any questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand, and I will be happy to call on you so you can say it live. So I'm gonna leave that leave the chat open. We actually, oh, looks like we have a question here. Give me 1 second. Hey Fritz, you have a question?
why is Israel so divided? I've read that the what do you call your attorney general is trying to take everything over. Am I saying it wrong? That the courts have decided to control Israel.
So, I'm, first of all, thanks for the question. I'm a process and procedure guy, so I didn't talk about any of the issues really, or any of the divisions, or any of the main topics that have been within the campaign for the last year and a half. So the Attorney General made a decision to go ahead and indict the Prime Minister. This decision was made between the first and second elections. There were indications already before the first election that we were going to go in that direction. Of course, we've never been in a situation in which you had a sitting prime minister indicted, and this is very unusual because you're talking about an attorney general who was a very big loyalist of the prime minister, who was his cabinet secretary. And it's a situation that a lot of people here in Israel have had a very, very tough time being able to swallow that pill. In terms of what Israeli public opinion is, so I'll say that Netanyahu, this is the 9th time that he's running as the head of the Likud party. The first time was in 96, then in 99, again in 06, 09, 13, 15, and then the last 3 times over the last calendar year. If you take all those 9 times together, his result in this past election of 36 seats is the biggest achievement he's had of all 9 elections, meaning he's at the peak of his popularity. So if you're looking at where a lot of people within the right-wing bloc are, so it's quite clear that just based on the support the prime minister is getting, that a lot of people are not exactly buying what it is that the attorney general is selling. Now,
Jeremy, if I may just pop in,
sure.
You yourself talk about the polls where the Likud, led by Netanyahu, are already polling at 40 and even 42 seats, which is unprecedented in modern history.
Yes, I talked about the polls, but the best poll, as we all know, is the election results. And considering we did have an election not too long ago, again, we did have 3 this year, which is crazy. But the fact that, again, if we're looking at 9 elections across over 3 decades, a situation where Netanyahu is at the highest level of popularity in terms of the amount of seats he's getting. Of course, in the polls, he's doing even better than he was right then. So obviously, you can understand where the Israeli public opinion is. What a lot of people don't understand is they say, how is it that he can still be prime minister if he's indicted? So we're in this situation, first of all, where his trial has not started. Again, the papers were submitted, but especially with the coronavirus, we don't exactly know when that trial will actually start. There's this value in democracy known as innocent until proven guilty. I know this is difficult for a lot of people to believe, but that, in terms of the value of equality, that also goes for politicians. And the law, which is a very interesting situation, the law says that a prime minister in Israel does not need to resign if he's indicted. The thought process is that if he does not have the popular opinion of the Israeli public, that their representatives in a parliamentary democracy, as they can, at any point just topple his government, right? Trump, whether people, on the other side, all those leftists who really, really hate Trump, there's not much they can do. They can try, as they did, to try to impeach him, but pretty much you're stuck in a situation where unless you have the votes, that the person is going to be president for 4 years. There's not much you can do about that. Within the parliamentary system, if on any given day, there's suddenly a decision by a majority of the people in the coalition that they no longer want to support the prime minister, they just topple the government and there's no more government. The fact that Netanyahu has been prime minister consecutively for the last 11 years shows again that he's had an ability to go ahead and really maintain a coalition over a bunch of different parties spanning a very long time, and being able to have the majority of the Israeli public with him on a majority of these issues. But, going back to the procedure part of it, so even once his trial starts, he's allowed to remain prime minister. According to what the law says, only when he's exhausted all appeals must he step down. And as prime minister, he gets 2 appeals. I'll give you my own personal opinion. I think that, as I said, you have this principle. It's very important in democracy that you're innocent until proven guilty. But my thought process is that if you are actually convicted and you're found guilty, maybe that's when the law should decide you're no longer fit for public office. But in fact, the Israeli law says even if you're prime minister and you're convicted and you're found guilty, you can stick around until all of your appeals have been exhausted. In terms of what the left feels, and they've run on this, they feel that the Attorney General, the fact that he has a very previous close relationship with the Prime Minister, that if he's going ahead and he's indicting him, means that he thinks that there's a very big case here. And they go ahead and they use a lot of the words that we hear a lot of times with Trump in terms of a lot of parallels of various corruption charges or various connections to things that might have been investigated, might not have been investigated, might have been investigated and did not actually lead to any forward process in terms of the police or the prosecutors. But that being said, again, you do have an indictment that right now the Prime Minister does not need to deal with because of the coronavirus. But once we go ahead and we do form a government, that is going to be something that we're going to have to deal with. It's not a usual situation to have, I think, in any country, a leader that's dealing with that. But we'll see, where we are when we're able to reopen the courts and form a government. One of the reasons why Benny Gantz has decided to go ahead and join this coalition, in my analysis, is that his thought process is that at a certain point, Netanyahu is going to be forced to step down. And if he makes this deal to become the vice prime minister or the deputy prime minister, that he'll be the next man up. So he's come to this sort of conclusion: if you can't beat them, join them, with the thought process that he thinks he'll be able to take over the government afterwards. But as I said, Netanyahu is just one leader of one party within the bloc. It's vital in an Israeli parliamentary system to be able to have a majority in the entire parliament, which Benny Gantz does not have, because he lost all of his friends that had supported him from the center-left bloc, and the right-wing bloc don't see him as sufficiently right-wing. So for right now, this serves our purposes because we'll be able to form a government and end this caretaker government, which started at this point 16 months ago, back in December of 2018. As crazy as that is, we're talking right now in April 2020. But the thought process that he has, that he's going to be able to somehow succeed and replace Netanyahu, I just don't think that's going to happen.
So Jeremy, I have a couple quick questions here, rapid fire for you.
Sure.
From Abraham Chamoy, the first one is, as long as there's no new government, Bibi remains the prime minister. That's correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then secondly, we have a question from G. Colwill. I don't know the first name. You said that Lieberman was a spoiler. What was his end game?
Well, that's difficult to say as a quick answer. The best way that I could summarize it is that he has a very, very long relationship with Netanyahu, dating back to Netanyahu's first term as prime minister from 96 to 99, when he was the prime minister's director general of his office. And they've had ups and downs. And if you want to go from the most mild opinion of they're just not compatible anymore, and there's personal animosity and there's not much you can do, to going all the way to the more conspiracy theories of Lieberman's legal troubles or something that he blames Netanyahu for, and stuff like that. So I think the best way to be able to summarize it is that Lieberman feels as someone who's really done everything within Israeli politics. Again, he's been a foreign minister twice. He's been defense minister once. He's been in a bunch of other important places within government over the last 20, 30 years. I don't think there's really much left for him to do other than prime minister. And since he's not popular enough to be prime minister, what he can do is be spoiler and have the opportunity to always be able to call press conference and be in the news and be important, because that seems to be the most that he can do these days.
Gotcha. Great stuff. Well, keep the questions coming, y'all. And we're going to move on to our next speaker. And of course, feel free to ask any of our panelists anytime, any questions. Next speaker, my dear friend Gidon Ariel. And Gidon is the founder and CEO of Root Source. It's an organization dedicated to promoting respectful relationships between pro-Israel Christians and Jews. His flagship program brings knowledgeable, authentic Israeli teachers and Christians and Jews together to study the Jewish texts and concepts that are foundational to their faith. Gidon made Aliyah from Queens, New York when he was 14. He spent close to a decade in advanced Jewish institutes, aka yeshivas, and the Israeli army. And after 20 years in the Tank Corps, he is now today a reserve officer in the IDF spokesperson's office. He is also a pioneer in Jewish-Christian relations in general, and he is a seasoned Hebrew and Judaism instructor and public speaker. Many of you have seen him in Dallas for some of our events from time to time. And Gidon is also a delegate to the Central Committee, the Merkaz of the Prime Minister of Netanyahu's Likud party. He ran for the Ma'ale Adumim City Council, and he currently lives in Ma'ale Hever, a suburb of Hebron in the West Bank, where he and his family moved in 2012. Without further ado, Gidon Ariel, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Benji, and it's a pleasure to be here with my friend Jeremy and Fleur. And I got the most important but the least sexy topic to talk about tonight, and that is Passover. What we first of all, I noticed that many of my Root Source friends from Dallas are on the call, so I'm happy to see you here. I can't shout out to any of you because we don't see everybody all together. Benji, why don't you put me in real in the front if you can, instead of seeing me just fake over there. You know what I mean? Let's.
Sure.
Okay. Right. Am I going to see me too? There. Now I see myself at least. For people who've never, first of all, for the Jews who are here, thanks, Revis. For the Jews who are here on the call, who have participated in the Passover holiday in their lifetimes, as well as some of the Christians here who I know who are excited to do that as well, then Passover is is a well-known holiday, and in fact, it is the second most important holiday in the Jewish religion. The first most important holiday is Shabbat. We celebrate Shabbat every week, the Sabbath. It is a recognition of the Jewish people. Everybody who celebrates the Shabbat, we testify that God created the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. Similarly, when we celebrate the Passover, we testify that God took the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt, out of their slavery, and brought them ultimately to the land of Israel, where they could be God's people and God could be their God. So that is why Passover is the second most important holiday. And in fact, in each and every one of our holidays, including Sabbath, we recognize during the Kiddush, when we sanctify the holiday on the holiday's eve, Friday night in case of Shabbat, in case of the Sabbath, or depending on this week, I believe the holiday starts on a Wednesday. So Tuesday night, we sanctify the holiday. That's when we're going to have our Seder. And I might have gotten that wrong. If I got it wrong, somebody correct me. I think it might be the Tuesday night or Wednesday night. I think it's Wednesday night.
Wednesday night.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I saw a lot of people. Thanks a lot, Benji. So when we say the kiddush, when we sanctify the holiday both on Passover, also on the other holidays, if it's the New Year's, Rosh Hashanah, or Yom Kippur even, or Tabernacles, Sukkot, we always mention Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim, in memory of the Exodus from Egypt, and that is what we're celebrating today. As opposed to what I think many people live in the here and now, the Jewish people very much live in history. We both live in the here and now and also in history. And in fact, our one of the important parts of the Seder, of the ritual Passover dinner that we are going to celebrate on Wednesday and on Thursday night, we say in each and every generation, each and every one of us is incumbent upon us. We are required to see ourselves as if we left Egypt ourselves. We aren't celebrating that 4,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago or some thousand years ago, something happened as great and wonderful as it was. We are actually celebrating ourselves leaving Egypt. In other words, each and every one of us has to recognize that we could have been slaves in Egypt to this day had God not brought us out of Egypt, out of slavery in Egypt. So that is a very important thing that not many people recognize, but people who think about Passover a lot recognize that this is what's important about Passover, and this is really what's important about the Jewish people ourselves. Shortly after leaving Egypt, we got the Torah on Mount Sinai, and that Torah is what is sometimes called the portable homeland for the Jewish people out throughout their thousands of years of exile. We stayed a nation because we remembered the Torah that we got after leaving Egypt, and now we are able today, since we are coming back to our land, we're still able to make that contact. So those are two aspects that I wanted to focus on: the importance of remembering that we left Egypt and we ourselves could have still been slaves in Egypt had we not been redeemed by God then, and the fact that the Torah is part of that exodus from Egypt. On the way to the land of Israel from Egypt, we had to pass through the Torah and get the Torah, which is the guidebook of life that God gave to us so that we could have a relationship with Him. Those are the two important bases of Passover. A very important aspect of Passover, of course, today is the matzah. Matzah, and Benji, while I'm talking, maybe you can steal my screen and show a picture of matzah if there's anybody who doesn't know what that is. What is called unleavened bread, and the Torah in the book of Exodus commanded us to eat unleavened bread because when we left Egypt, we didn't have time for our bread to rise. We were in the middle of baking bread. We were hungry, but God said, leave now in the middle of the night and take that bread with you. Well, we didn't have time even for the bread to rise. I think that this is an important aspect for us as well, that nowadays everybody wants to plan well, make sure that you got things on time. Let's prepare it a little bit. Let's even go have a run through or something like that. As far as the Jewish people are concerned, you never know when you're going to have to get up and leave without thinking twice about anything. You can't even tie your shoes. We've all got to get out of Egypt, even though we've been waiting we were slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years, 240 years if I'm not mistaken. But at this night now, everybody pick up quickly. We got to get out of here. And that is what we as the Jewish people always had to recognize when we were in exile, that you never know what the evil ruler of our host country is going to have in store for us. Anybody who ever saw the movie Fiddler on the Roof knows what I'm talking about. But also it's important for us to recognize that we, even in Israel, even though we thank God have our own independent state and we're in charge of ourselves, even still things are running a mile a minute, and we also always have to be ready for things to change. And I think that's another message of Passover. I will take questions in a minute, but first I'll just finish off with a third idea that I had about Passover, and that is something that I will connect it now to what we're having this year in Israel, and I think all over the world. The first night of Passover in Israel and all around the world, everywhere besides Israel, for a ritually legalistic reason that I won't go into now, we have 2 nights of Seder everywhere in the world, but in Israel we have 1 night of Seder. The Seder is the ritual dinner that is held in the homes of each and every Jewish person all around the world, where we retell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. We enjoy our family together, and we have a delicious meal. And it is really, I think it can very much be compared to a Thanksgiving meal, as far as I remember. I haven't been in America for a while, but I think you get all of your family members together. Sometimes you have 10, 20, 30 people at a Thanksgiving meal. Well, guess what? That's the way it is on Pesach, on Passover as well, that all the family gets together. Our prime minister, who is right now one of the leading leaders of the entire world as far as trying to figure out what we're going to do with this coronavirus, as we still call it in Israel. I understand in the United States, for some reason, they're calling it COVID-19. That's fine. It's okay. I guess it's translation between Hebrew and English. But Netanyahu said something very important and something very special, that every year we celebrate a Seder. A Seder, the word in Hebrew means order, but it is understood to be this festive meal. This year we are celebrating the Seder in a Seger. A Seger means a closure. And that means you don't have this festive family meal together with your family. You have it, everybody in their own home. This Netanyahu said already, I think 2 weeks ago, and it was crazy. And people who are used to seeing their grandparents for the first, once a year or something like that, they said, no. The only way that you can express your love for your grandparents is to not be together with them in the same room. They have to have virtual quarantine in their home. You have to be virtual quarantine in your own home. And this is something that we haven't seen ever in our lifetimes, ever. And with God's help, we will never see it again. But this time it is giving us an opportunity to exercise our imaginations. And I'll give you an example. As some of you might recognize, I've got a little beard going on over here. That's because my mother passed away a couple of weeks ago. And it is a Jewish tradition not to shave when you're in mourning. So, and while I was in mourning, it is another tradition. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'd much rather spend time on the happy Passover holiday. It's another tradition that people come and visit you when you sit in your home and accept people who have come to console you. Nobody was visiting anybody this year. Everybody was sitting at home in their own shiva, as it were. So I got a lot of people visiting me on Zoom and a lot of people giving me calls. So the same way today, people are thinking, how can we celebrate Passover even though we're not allowed to be there? So there are people who are getting together by Zoom. People are getting together. People who are more orthodox or more traditional, and they do not use the computer on a festive day, so they are getting together before the holiday in the afternoon. Everybody seeing each other on the screen, and then when we're all done with the Zoom Seder, then we go and have a quick official Seder afterwards. And I just saw something else interesting. I didn't even get a chance to look into it even more in depth. There's a popular rabbi in Israel. His name is Rabbi Benny Lau. He is actually the nephew of Rabbi Yisrael Lau, who was the chief rabbi of Israel. Rabbi Benny Lau is a very popular young fellow. He came up with this idea that he has recorded the entire 2 or 3 hour long Passover Seder. It is going to be broadcast on regular TV in Israel, but on a special channel so that you can turn on the TV on Wednesday afternoon, and there will be nothing on the screen. And when it is time to do the Seder, Rabbi Lau will appear and you say, "Hello, everybody. Welcome to my Seder. I'm in the Seder together." I don't know exactly how he's going to do it, but he will give people the feeling that they are in a Seder together with them. It's something that we haven't, we've never seen such a thing, but it's giving an opportunity for imaginative, creative solutions. And that is really the third thing, the final thing that I want to finish up here before I take some questions. And that is, the Jewish people have always been a very creative people. And we always are trying to find in the depths of difficulty how we can come out even better than this. And this is something this is a theme that I'm seeing again and again, both in Israel and the United States and all over the world. People are saying we're going to come out even stronger with God's help. So that's all I've got to say. I didn't want to take up too much time. Benji, if you want to ask me some of these questions, or maybe ask some people.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gidon. So it looks like there's a few questions here. First one you have is, can you share your thoughts on the relationship between the current events and Passover? I guess touch on a little bit if there's any kind of correlation there. Or can you make an analogy there?
Listen, well, there are two current events, as my esteemed partners on this panel are bookending me. We've got the political things that are going on in Israel, and in some way also in the United States. I mean, it is, after all, a presidential election year. And of course, the coronavirus, which is really taking over the entire news cycle here. I mean, really, sometimes you'll have 5 or 6 items on the hourly news. About 7 of them are about Corona nowadays. So, what can I say? The idea that we were this close to dying in Egypt. We were at the 50th gate, according to our rabbis. We were the 50th gate of the depths, and God took us out of there up until the 50th gate on the top. Right now, we don't know what's going to happen with the coronavirus. Nobody knows. And frankly, just today, the little bit that I managed to hear on the news, 2 major leaders in the Israeli medical field had a little, more than just a little, argument with each other on, I think it was national TV, or certainly it was on national news radio. So nobody really knows what's going to be going on over here. And that's really the way it was for the Jewish people, the Israelites, still in Egypt. Nobody knew what was going to happen until, from nowhere almost, God took them out of that. And I think that, pardon me for mixing current events with perhaps ultimate events, but there's a phrase in Hebrew. Maybe somebody can help me out here. I don't remember if it's in the Bible or if it's in the rabbinic sayings. As the days from when I brought you out of the land of Egypt, I will show you wonders. And we can only pray and believe that we will see the kind of wonders, and even greater wonders than we saw with the 10 plagues and with the splitting of the Red Sea, all of these things that happened together with the Exodus from Egypt and the story of Passover. So we will, with God's help, see in our time speedily as well. Thank you.
My question is,
Yes,
are we allowed to bring Elijah into our homes with the COVID-19 happening? What's the deal there?
I'll explain to people who aren't so sure what he's talking about. Elijah, the prophet, is a guest in theory at everyone's Passover Seder meal. It is because he is the harbinger of the Messiah, of the ultimate Redeemer. So what we do is we open up the door a little bit. We let Elijah in, and there's a cup of wine that is on the table that is ready for Elijah. If you've got little children at your Seder, then you'll shake the table a little bit so that it looks like Elijah is drinking his wine. And then he leaves on to the next family. When I was a kid, I thought that sounded a lot like Santa Claus, but okay, everybody to each his own. But really now in Israel, and I'm sure by you also, nobody gets anywhere near anybody, 6 feet difference, and nobody even comes to the door. So what Benji said with a smirk is, how is Elijah going to be able to? Let me tell you, when Elijah comes, when the Messiah comes, we're going to let him in no matter how much of a coronavirus there is.
Amen. Amen. That's great. Well, keep the questions coming, y'all. If there's any more Passover-related questions, please put them in the chat or raise your digital hand there, and we'll definitely circle back to those.
Okay, if there aren't any Passover questions, then I'm going to ask if Jeremy lets me field a few political questions also.
Yes. Yeah, there are some other questions here. Yeah, want to take those now? We can take those now. Give me a second here. So looks like there's a couple questions regarding the government as well. Will this government start exercising sovereignty over the West Bank? It's a question we have from Fernando.
Thank you, Fernando. This seems to be the latest today's topic, at least as far as my Likud mid-tier leadership WhatsApp groups, is will the government succeed in happening? Will Gantz be able to come into the government, even though many of the people on the right in the Likud and to the right of the Likud saying, no, we want there already to be the West Bank becoming part of Israel, just as we had talked about over a year ago. Before the elections, before the first elections, more than a year ago, President Trump said he came out with the deal of the century, the pathway to prosperity, I think it was also called, and it seemed very clear to us that he's okay with Israel. What's the word over there, Jeremy? The settlements is accepting them into
or neighborhoods. I believe Ambassador Friedman said we should use the language of neighborhoods.
Yeah, but what I'm talking about is that they now become part of the state of Israel, annexing them. That also might not be the right word, but
applying Israeli sovereignty.
Applying Israeli sovereignty. Thank you very much. Now,
I don't like the word annexation just because you annex something that's not yours. You apply sovereignty to something that's yours.
Jeremy, I've been in Israel for about 40 years, so cut me a little slack if I can't remember the exact word. I agree with you.
I'm just making sure we're on the same talking points.
You know we are. The sovereignty of the communities in Israel, in Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank, is a topic that we've almost forgotten about between all of these elections and between all of this corona. But thankfully, we in the Likud, and I'm sure in Yamina as well, have not forgotten it, and we're saying that this is the most important thing for us. Is that going to be a deal breaker? Is, as Jeremy mentioned over here before, Gantz recognizing that he can't turn back and try to find any friends amongst the left-wingers. Maybe he'll say, you know what, maybe the right wing is okay, and maybe he'll join the right wing. Who knows? He was just in the army up until recently. Maybe he's not such a left-winger after all. But we don't know the answer, and I think we have everybody on the panel is in agreement that is something that we'd really like to see, and we thought that it was just a shoo-in only a few months ago.
There's also a question asking about the
Benji. Who's asking the question?
Abraham Chamoy, mentioning the article specifically in the Jerusalem Post said that Orthodox are allowed Zoom for Passover Seders. This week, the chief rabbis of Israel said it is not. Given there was no barisa in the Talmud to settle this, and given Trump's kids, Chabad rabbis, given permission to travel on Shabbos when it did not seem like life or death, wouldn't protecting people's lives from COVID-19 count under pikuach nefesh and allow this?
Okay, we got a little bit of jargon over here. Pikuach nefesh means saving a life. And saving a life is the most important thing in the Jewish religion, bar none. And the answer is absolutely. The COVID-19 situation is an incredible situation of pikuach nefesh, of saving lives. And therefore, it is important that nobody try to have a Seder together with people who you don't know where they were from. If you were just in a quarantine for 30 days, and I was in quarantine for 30 days, and we're next door neighbors, and we can be sure that we can be together, well, then ask me in a private message. But up until then, for the entire state of Israel, the entire country, the prime minister and the health ministry and the army also is getting into the picture. It says it's one law for everyone. Everybody has to have these seders without each other. And it's not like we're saying, well, since it's pikuach nefesh, then we'll be together, but we'll be able to drive together. No. None of this traveling. No, even if you aren't religious, no traveling on Passover. Stay in your homes. It's something that we're not familiar with, but it's something that we're going to have to see this year.
Makes sense. And I think that was the questions we have on there so far. We'll come back to a couple other ones later, if you don't mind, Gidon.
Okay.
And without further ado, I want to introduce our next speaker here, Fleur Hassan. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you being here with us. Fleur grew up in Gibraltar, did I pronounce that correct?
That's right.
And studied law at King's College, London University. She qualified as a barrister in Middle Temple in 1997. And
Barrister. Barrister is the person making coffee.
Barrister. Middle Temple in 1997 and practiced in London before immigrating to Israel in 2001. In Israel, she worked at JDC in resource development for Europe and later became the executive director of Tikva, a nonprofit organization saving abandoned and abused Jewish children from the former Soviet Union. In 2011, she set up her own communications consulting business, Message Experts, and does consulting work for large corporations as well as nonprofit organizations on effective communication strategies. In May 2016, Fleur became the city councilor in Jerusalem, and in February 2017, the leader of the opposition. In November 2018, Fleur was reelected to the Jerusalem Municipal Council and was appointed deputy mayor for foreign relations. Fleur is currently the only British politician in Israel and is involved in the advancement of women's rights and marginalized population groups in the city and economic development in the fight for a pluralistic Jerusalem. Thank you so much for being here, Fleur.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Sure.
Am I waiting for a question?
No, go ahead. I just want to, if you want to just expand on the, just expand on what's happening on the ground in Israel and how COVID-19 coronavirus is affecting the people, and I guess start there, if you don't mind.
Okay.
And especially in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Yeah. So Jerusalem is the largest city in the country by quite a lot. We have 920,000 people. The next biggest city in the country is Tel Aviv with almost 500,000. So we're almost double the next size city. We're also the most, some people don't realize this, we're also the most diverse city in the country. We have 37% Arab population, 25% ultra-Orthodox population, 22% secular population, and the rest is a mixture of people from traditional to Zionist religious. So we have an incredibly diverse city. And that comes with its challenges. I always believe that diversity is actually a wonderful thing, a thing that we have to be proud of. In fact, the DNA of Jerusalem is one of diversity. King David decided to build his city or to his kingdom 3,000 years ago in Jerusalem because it was the only area that didn't belong to one tribe. So it was the area that all tribes could come and gather and come to the temple. And so our very DNA is a DNA of diversity. And we try and keep this DNA, going and strengthening the different types of people that live in our city. but it poses a lot of challenges. And the main challenge that it poses is that both the ultra-Orthodox population and the Arab population are extremely socioeconomically poor population groups for different reasons. So the Arab population group, unfortunately, have a completely bankrupt educational system, courtesy of the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Workers Association, which is a UN committee that is supposed to be helping Palestinian refugees, but instead makes their situation even worse. And they, unfortunately, for historical reasons, are in charge of education of the Arab children in Jerusalem. And they do a few things which are terrible for the population. One is they teach, anti-Semitism, and they teach hatred, and they teach incitement. But the second thing, which is, I think, even worse, is that they don't teach them Hebrew. And for that reason, when these kids are 18 years old, they have very few options in front of them because they've been living in a city where they've been purposely not taught the language of the city where they could get good job opportunities and higher education. So we have a population that has been not taught the language of the city that they live in. When they're 18 years old, it ends up becoming a gender issue because the boys go out to work and they somehow learn Hebrew on the streets. They work in construction, low paid work in construction, they work in supermarkets, they work in trade, and the women have children, get married, have children, and they don't go out to work, so they never learn Hebrew. And when they're 28 years old, the women realize that they have to come and bring an income for their families. It's already very difficult to start learning a new language. And so we have a situation where we have the lowest workforce participation in the entire Middle East, the women, the Arab women in Jerusalem. So that means that we have a very, very poor population group in Jerusalem, which becomes a socially marginalized population group as well. I'm not even talking about politics, we're talking pure socioeconomics. Now, the ultra-Orthodox have similar challenges, but for different reasons. So in the ultra-Orthodox community, the women are the ones who go out to work, and the men, 1 in 2 men don't work. And the reason why it's even harder for them to work, even if they want to, is because the ultra-Orthodox leaders have created an educational system where the boys stop learning math and English when they're 11 years old. They don't learn core curriculum subjects. So once again, the leaders are responsible for the miseducation of their own people. And so boys, when they want to leave, if you're in the yeshiva world, you're okay. If you want to leave the yeshiva world, you have a problem because the only thing that you can do with your education that you've been given in the ultra-Orthodox school system is stack shelves in a supermarket. So we have a situation where they're very, very different groups, of course. One is a Jewish ultra-Orthodox group and the other one is an Arab group, but for different political, religious reasons, both of these groups have been kept down educationally, and therefore they're very, very difficult to integrate into the workforce and to higher education. Which means that basically Jerusalem has the lowest workforce participation rate in the entire country. And that is a huge challenge. Now, Jerusalem and myself in particular, I hold a foreign relations portfolio. I also hold an economic development portfolio. All I do every day is be concerned by these two population groups to try and mainstream them into regular society through accelerated learning programs, through job opportunities in high tech, through scholarships, you name it. We are really working very hard to try and integrate these two problematic population groups into mainstream higher education and mainstream quality employment. That is really the mission that we have in our city. And when people ask me, why is this what I do? Is because ultimately we're all living in the same city. And if you're all on the same boat and one side of the boat has a hole in it, the whole ship is going to sink. And so it's important for the unity of my city and for the prosperity of my city that we take the two weakest population groups in our city and try and give them equal opportunities. They have equal rights, but they don't have equal opportunities, mainly because of their own leaderships. But this is something that we're constantly working. Now, when something like the corona comes along, you have a situation that we are the poorest city in the country, mainly because of these two groups. And the majority of our economy is based on service industry jobs. So we're talking about education, we're talking about tourism jobs, culinary, cultural, restaurants. These are the majority of the jobs in the city are this. The other side, you have, of course, government workers and education. They're okay. But the part of the industry that is based on service is completely collapsed. So we have we're the poorest city in the country. We have the two poorest population groups in the country living in the largest numbers in our city, the capital city of the state of Israel, the capital city of the Jewish people. And then you have the COVID-19, which has basically eradicated the entire service industry, which is the only way that the city can actually try and sustain itself. And so we have a very difficult situation. What are we doing to try and remedy the situation at the moment? Well, first of all, we need to make sure that people can eat. So we're going down to basic needs. So we take everybody that was on our welfare service list, and we add all the people who've lost their jobs and can't make a living and can't bring food for their family. And in the last week, we've given out 17,000 food packages across the city. That's the situation that we're in right now. I'm busy raising funds from all over the world. And the idea is that we need, the first matter of action is to make sure that nobody goes hungry, to make sure that nobody loses their homes, to make sure that the special needs children, we have 6,000 special needs families in our city, to make sure that the parents have got all the tools that they need to be able to cope with the fact that their children are at home all day. Remember, all special needs children in our city are in frameworks until 6 o'clock at night. These are very challenging children that are now home all day. And a third of those special needs families are living under the poverty line. So we have a very, very challenging situation. On top of all that, we have the situation with the ultra-Orthodox community and the Arab community that live in very crowded conditions. The density in the neighborhoods of the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs, it's very high density. And so, this week we've had a lot of criticism to the ultra-Orthodox community. And the ultra-Orthodox community are victims. They're not the perpetrators of what's happening to them. They're the victims of A, their leaders not coming out on time and making sure that they understand the severity of the situation, and B, the fact that they're poor and they're living in crowded conditions, many, many members of the family. We have in 50, 60 meter apartments, that's about 600 square feet apartments, 7, 8 kids crowded in 2, 3 bedroom apartments. And so we have a situation which is almost not sustainable in the ultra-Orthodox community, compounded by the fact that their leadership did not take on the responsibility of their community early enough. Now most of them are complying, and compounded to the fact that you also have a very poor community. Looking at the Arab community, we have a different situation. They're also overcrowded, but Arabs actually tend to live in bigger houses, bigger families, but bigger houses. The problem in the Arab community is that the message didn't get to them. In Jerusalem, there's no leadership in the Arab community of Jerusalem. There's zero leadership. They don't vote in local elections, which means they don't have any representatives. They don't vote because they don't want to vote, because they come under all sorts of Palestinian Authority political pressure not to vote, which means that the Arab community is unrepresented in the city council. People like me, who are pluralists, who take care of everybody, make sure that their voices are heard, but that's not good enough. They should have their own representatives in city council. And so you have a situation where the ultra-Orthodox leadership have let them down. The Arab leadership is non-existent, so the message didn't get through. And so you have these two communities which are already economically marginalized. Now we're realizing they're completely socially marginalized. And in these communities, in the Arab community, testing only started on Thursday. We set up an amazing drive-in for testing. A drive-in is a very smart idea because you don't have to get out of the car. You don't have to endanger anybody. You go through with your car, they test you with your car, you move on, you get the results in 2 days. So we have a situation where now we're beginning to test the Arab community. We're praying that the Arab community is less affected than the ultra-Orthodox community, because otherwise we have 330,000 people in East Jerusalem that it could inflame the whole east part of the city. It's a very dangerous situation. Ultra-Orthodox, we're already beginning to see that the numbers are going up steadily. The mayor of Jerusalem, I think, has been doing a fantastic job in leading us through this crisis. And our policy from now on is like this. We're trying to, first of all, identify the sick, because if we don't know who they are, then we can't isolate them. The second stage is to separate the sick from the healthy. How do we do that? We've taken over 5 hotels in the city. These are the people who are not very sick, who need hospitalization. There are people who are mild, have mild symptoms, but we have to separate them from the rest of the house that they live in, the rest of their families, the rest of their neighborhood, because then they endanger everybody. So at the moment, the policy is A, test much more, B, separate the sick from the healthy, and C, try and make sure that the sick are recovering. And of course, overall that, ensuring that people have basic needs, ensuring that the elderly are not alone. We've developed an amazing, I'm so proud of my city. We've developed a network of volunteers in the thousands. At the beginning, when this whole thing started, we had more volunteers than what to do with them. And today we've assigned to every elderly person a volunteer. They can't go in physically, but they are their advocate. They take care of them. They make sure they have their medicines. They make sure they have food brought to their door. They make sure they're not alone. They speak to them on the phone. We've assigned 1 volunteer for every elderly person in the city. We've assigned 2 volunteers to every special needs family in the city. Again, to make sure they have what they need, to make sure they're not going crazy. We just distributed games and colors and books to all the special needs families in the city. So we've organized ourselves, I believe, extremely well. People have shown an amazing amount of kindness in volunteering their time, volunteering their services. Today, I was with a group, actually a Christian group called the Joseph Project, who brought tons of diapers. And today they brought tons of games. And last week they brought food. And so we're seeing kindness from so many people in so many places. And we're making sure that that kindness goes into real impact. We need to get through the next month, month and a half. We need to make sure that people don't crash under the pressure of not having an income. And we need to make sure that we have an emergency fund to get us back on our feet. And I want to just touch a little bit on what Jeremy said, talked about the politics at the beginning. The net result of this crazy year of not having a government, and I agree with Jeremy, I put the blame on Avigdor Lieberman because he betrayed his camp in order to bring down a prime minister for purely personal reasons. We've had 1 year of no government. And so the preparedness that we had for this terrible crisis has not been what it should have been. It's good, but it could have been better if we would have had a functioning government. And I blame the selfish politicians who were motivated by hatred and by trying to take out a prime minister instead of by loving the people that they're supposed to be serving. And so I pray that we have a government soon in order to be able to cope with this devastating situation. We've gone from the lowest unemployment rate in history to the highest unemployment rate in history, from 4% to 25%. And we can bounce back. We are a resilient people, we're a resilient country, but we need to have a functioning government. And so the quicker all these egos decide to make a deal, the better for all of us, and that's what they should be doing. And please God, we hope that we see this happening in the next few days. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Fleur. That was really insightful, really amazing insight there. I have a couple questions. One is from Jay Aronovich. Fleur, how is stay-at-home policy being enforced in Jerusalem, especially amongst groups that you so eloquently described, he asks?
So look, ultimately, I think that people, not from the problematic communities, were staying at home already for a couple of weeks. I mean, for a couple of weeks, I had some meetings, and a couple of weeks ago, I said, I'm not going in anymore. The mayor started to do all his meetings by Zoom. And I think most people followed suit. Now, in the ultra-Orthodox communities, it took a little bit longer because the leaders weren't weren't determined enough at the time, or made it clear enough. But now I believe, firstly, that most people are in isolation at home with their families because they understand that that's what they need to do to save themselves and their communities. Of course, you have the troublemakers. You will always have the troublemakers in any community. And those troublemakers we are dealing with the full force of the law. We have police officers everywhere. We have blocked streets to understand which people are going into neighborhoods. We are trying to keep people within their own neighborhoods. I, for example, have a pass as an essential worker. If I got stopped and I didn't have the pass as an essential worker, I would have to go back home. It's happening. People it's being enforced. We're not quite at the point of a full lockdown, but we're pretty close to the full lockdown. And I think that most people are simply being responsible, walking within 100 meters of their homes, which is still allowed, going to groceries, stocking up whenever they can. Of course, we've got Pesach coming, and Gidon gave us a wonderful shiur, a wonderful, teaching us a little bit about Pesach. And again, people, it's a very surreal thing. And I want to add one more thing. Gidon spoke about the creativeness of the Jewish people, the creativity of the Jewish people. I'm involved in a program where we want people, we have lots of different members of Knesset involved, where we want people to do their seders, if they can, either outside in their balcony or with open windows. And at 8:30, we're all going to go out and sing Manishtana in everybody together, all Am Yisrael, in order for the elderly people or the people who are home alone to open their windows and understand that we are one people doing one Seder. We're just divided at the moment physically, but spiritually, we're one people doing what we have to do to save our country. We're doing it together, but separate, and we'll all be singing together loudly so that everybody can hear us and those people don't feel alone.
That's beautiful. Somebody that doesn't keep the Yontif needs to record that, because that's an incredible scene, I'm sure.
I can find a few Arab friends who can do that for us.
Please do, and post it to our group. We'd love to see that.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah. So there's another question. It's and I'm happy to take other questions on COVID-19 in Israel and anything political arena in Israel. There is one here that we skipped that says, is there truth to the story that if Gantz agreed to the proposed deal for the rational government after the second election, taking over after 6 months, then he would be weeks away from becoming prime minister now? Is there truth to that?
Yeah, of course he would have if Bibi would have moved. We will never know.
Fair point. And let's see what else we have here. Any other questions, Fleur? Go ahead, Fleur.
Yeah, fine, go ahead.
The population's center in Jerusalem right now, I mean, what does that comprise? What's the percentages, Arab versus Jewish at this point in Israel?
In Israel or in Jerusalem?
I'm assuming it's in Jerusalem, I should say.
I said at the beginning, 37% of the city are Arab residents. And the rest, of course, is Jewish. We have a very small Christian population, a couple of percentages, not that big.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Gidon, Jeremy, do you have anything you want to add to what we've been discussing? Any other questions, feel free to post them or raise your hand, everybody. But you guys want anything to add?
Benji, while Fleur was talking, Jeremy and I had a little question between us. We were talking about I don't remember whose question this was. I believe it was Jarano. Whoever remembers, let them remember. If Lieberman betrayed his voters, if when he at first was elected on a right-wing platform and then all of a sudden switched to the left wing. And so some people here said that he betrayed the right wing. Some people said he betrayed all of Israel. And some people said Jeremy said he actually betrayed his voters. And I'm asking Jeremy, if he betrayed his voters, are we seeing them leaving in the polls that you so very well follow, jumping from his party, Lieberman's party, and moving over to Likud or Yamina or another right-wing party? Or are we still seeing Lieberman stay with the same 6 mandates that he's got?
I'm always happy to talk about the polls. What I can tell you is that if we look at the second election where Lieberman had 8 seats, he dropped down to 7 seats. Of course, in the third election, the average he's getting right now in the polls is 6. In the polls taken, there were about 6 public polls since the election. I can tell you from private polls that I've seen, some of them have him down at 5, some of them have him down at 4. However you want to look at that, that's pretty negative in terms of momentum. Let's remember that it wasn't too long ago, and I wrote this in the chat, that Lieberman used to be the leader of a double-digit party. I mean, there's a reason why he was able to have senior positions over the last several years. In the 2006 election, when Likud got 12 seats, Lieberman got 12 seats. In 2009, he had 15 seats. In 2013, he had 13 seats as part of Likud Beitenu. So, you know, this was a very large party. And if we're looking at what used to be a considered a very big party, which, you know, the best polls had him at 20, 21 seats in his heyday, to the fact where he's down to 7 seats in the current Knesset. And again, the polls are having him right now averaging at 6, and a lot of private polls underneath. I think there's a definite price that he's paying for a lot of the decision making that he's gone with over the last little while. I mean, in general, one of the problems that Lieberman has been dealing with is that for many people that are a part of his community of the former Soviet Union, they were people that voted for his party when they felt they needed to vote for a party of Russians. And the younger generation no longer feels that they need to do that. And in terms of the older population, which still do vote for him, unfortunately, as happens in every country, the amount of old people voting goes down each year if you're looking at those specific people from that, you know, oldest demographic. So I think that Lieberman is paying a price. I think it's very clear based on both election results and the polls that we're looking both private and public. And the overall trend is, if this was a person we were talking about as a potential prime minister candidate, this is a person who's fighting just for his political survival.
Interesting. Jeremy, can you talk about raising a threshold for Knesset party / membership? JRN just wants to find out.
Sure. One of the things I can tell you is that there used to not be an electoral threshold at all, right? If we said there was 120 Knesset members, that meant that if you got 0.8% of the vote, you would get a Knesset seat. Over time, what they did is they created a threshold where if you don't pass that threshold, your votes do not count. It started at 1%, then it went up to 1.5%, then 2%. Before the 2015 election, it was raised to 3.25%, which is roughly 4 seats. It's technically 3.9 seats, but the statistical probability that that would come out is pretty low. It's pretty much 4 seats, 3.25%. And by going ahead and doing that, what happened is that we saw a very big shift in Israeli politics. I said in the last Knesset, the 23rd Knesset, we only had 8 lists that were elected to the Knesset. That's an all-time record for the fewest amount. It used to be, before they raised the threshold, you would have many, many parties that were elected to the Knesset because they knew that they could pass a threshold on their own. When you have that 4-seat minimum, it puts a situation where people are not sure if they are going to be able to go ahead and pass, because the way the electoral rules are here, it's similar to the way it is in primaries in the States. You have to file by a certain time, and you don't know necessarily how you're going to be doing 6 weeks, 8 weeks later from the time of filing in terms of where you're going to be on election day. It ends up causing a lot of joint tickets in which you have lists that are made up of multiple parties. So I said you only had 8 lists that actually ended up in the latest Knesset, but actually we had a record high of 22 parties that were elected on those 8 lists, except for Yisrael Beitenu and Shas. The other 6 lists all had at least 2 parties running on them. Even the Likud, they had Kulanu running with them, even though this time around there was only one MK that was technically a part of Kulanu. But the point is that there's been a lot of talk of trying to lower the threshold to try to bring more stability to the Israeli system. The thought process was if you raise the threshold and you had less parties, it would be a lot easier to form a government. What happened is you have less lists, and that means you have less options in terms of forming a government. You also have a situation where these lists are made up of people who disagree on many issues. And because of that, internally, they do not end up agreeing on anything, which causes to splits anyway. We saw that in blue and white. We see this right now also happening with the Gesher Labor Merits list, where together they had 7 seats. Now there are 3 separate parties in Knesset. So the thought process is if we lower it back, maybe then we'll have a more stable system. Indeed, we'll have more parties, but this thought process that raising the threshold would bring us more stability, unfortunately brought us 3 elections. So perhaps by lowering the threshold and allowing the smaller parties to run on their own, we'll have a situation where we have a lot of parties and a lot of options, and then whoever needs to form the government will have an easier task in doing so because he can sort of pit them against each other, as opposed to the current situation where there's only 8 lists and there's not a lot of room to maneuver.
Jeremy, is there...
I don't agree with you in the sense that I think that the problem in Israel is that small parties have a disproportionate amount of power in bringing down a government. And I don't think that's healthy. So I would love to go back to the European or American system where there's 2 main parties or 3 parties. And then you have a winner and a loser. And you don't have to be cobbling together a coalition. You just, if you win, you win. And if you don't, you don't. At the moment, I just feel that when a little party can actually decide the fate of an entire country with barely 5 seats, 6 seats, that's a disproportionate amount of power. It is the most democratic way of electing a government, but I think it's very dysfunctional.
So my rebuttal to that, Fleur, would be, and I found this within a lot of the political situations that I've been in. You know this from Jerusalem, as you mentioned, with Haredim and Arabs. I sit on a regional council of planning and building, along with other municipalities, Abu Ghosh, which is Arab, and Telstone, which is ultra-Orthodox. When you don't have a situation where a lot of these minorities are able to express themselves and get representation, what ends up happening is you end up in a very, very dangerous situation. As much as I don't like Lieberman, and both of us credit the situation we are in to Lieberman, the fact is that all of those old grandmas that are Russian and are voting Lieberman, they've never, learned the language. They're immigrants that are having a tough time, and they don't really have any other option. If we were to go ahead and outlaw his party or raise the threshold to the point where it would be impossible for them to go ahead and have the representation, you would end up in a situation where, you wouldn't necessarily have, as you said, a winner or a loser. I think you would have a lot of losers. I also think it would be very difficult for any side to really be able to get 50% of the vote. We just had this facade of Gantz going ahead and supporting the joint list with a lot of their demands in order to try to put pressure on Netanyahu in unity talks. If we were to go to a 2-party system, you would have a situation where Gantz and the Arabs would be voting for essentially the same ticket. And although it might work the first time or the second time, you'd have a situation where they would just become disenfranchised and stop voting. And you would have, like in the States, a situation where the voting turnout, instead of where it is by us, which is over 70%, it would probably end up being under 50%. I think that's a very big issue, especially when you're trying to integrate a lot of these minorities into an Israeli society.
Jeremy, raising the level to 10 seats would be fine, and anybody who doesn't, they just wouldn't be voting for the smaller parties. They'd be voting for Likud or whatever the central left party would be, or the Arab Party.
Again, I think that just brought us where we are today.
But Jeremy, did I understand that you're saying that it's actually something on the table to lower this threshold from 3.75 down? Who's talking about that besides you?
Besides me. Well, as I'm sure you remember, the first ones to go ahead and talk about this issue were the Arabs, who were not happy with the joint list. A lot of them were very, how can I call it, were very apprehensive and did not want to have a list in which you have communists and nationalists that are on the same ticket. And the only thing that they have going for them together is that they're a list of non-Jews. Yeah. After they ended up having a very high number of seats in the last election, they've been talking a lot less about that. And what has been talked about is more on the right side. I'm sure you remember a lot of articles coming out of Otzma, the Kahanist party, that talked about potentially exiting the race in return for lowering the threshold. There were negotiations with that, with Likud. I can tell you that there are other members of, for instance, the Amin Alliance that I'm a part of. I personally don't necessarily think we need to make changes to that, but there are people within our alliance that think we should lower the threshold. If you speak also to people in labor and merits, of course, if you speak to Orly Levy, she would also like to see the threshold lowered. I can tell you now that Hauser and Hendel, the new 2MK unit that's called Derech Eretz that broke off of Blue and White, they would also like to see the threshold lowered. So you might not necessarily be seeing this a lot within the articles on the headlines, since we're talking about Corona, but behind the scenes where everyone's talking about the politics and the coalition agreements, this is one of the things that has been mentioned. And I can tell you for sure for Amir Peretz, who's the head of the Labor Party, who's very close to joining this coalition, which in itself is a very interesting situation, since he's even further left than Gantz is, that's one of the things that he wants to put in the coalition agreement itself, meaning he wants that to be signed as part of the agreement with the party, and he also wants that to be part of the coalition guidelines, that the other coalition partners would agree to that. Is that something that he's going to get? I'm not so sure he's going to get that, but this is something that is being discussed by a lot more people than just me.
Jeremy, I want to get to two quick other questions, if you don't mind. We're a little bit over, but it's not a problem. It's a great conversation. The situation in Gaza, if they were to run out of ventilators, how would the government deal with the Gaza situation? Basically, exchange of prisoners, threats, things of that nature. With Naftali Bennett as the Minister of Defense, I mean, how are they dealing with the situation over there and supplies and supply chains?
I mean, one of the things that really hasn't changed much is the transfer of goods into Gaza. There's not been much of a change there. Of course, in terms of a demand, they need a lot of supplies now medically. The situation that they have right now in Gaza is a lot better than a lot of areas within Israel right now. There are various talks at various levels. You also have the United Nations. You have Nikolai, who's the Bulgarian representative for the UN, who is working very hard to go ahead and work a lot of the secret channels, since there are a lot of people we don't talk to directly in the Gaza Strip. Overall, like I said, because the situation is not as bad there as perhaps you might be seeing on social media, it's not at the most top urgent level of the issues that the defense minister is dealing with now, but it is being dealt with. There are people on the ground who are dealing with what needs to be dealt with in terms of the security precautions we need in order to increase the amount of supplies and goods that are going to go into Gaza. Of course, in terms of self-quarantine over there, so again, you have to make sure that you have the shops filled with all of their supplies so that people can actually go ahead and maintain the self-quarantine without going into a situation of a lot of potential problematic situations.
Right.
But overall, I don't think that, at least based on the stuff that I'm reading on social media, compared to what I know from the discussions I'm having, I don't think the level of alert that I'm seeing versus what's happening on the ground, I see a very big gap between those two things.
Right, absolutely. And then finally, I want to ask also a question. When did they shut everything down in Jerusalem? And I guess to broaden that question, when did they shut everything down across the entire country? Have they done that? And do you think the response, and this is to Fleur and Gidon, do you think the response has been adequate to this point? Is there anything that Israel as a government could have done differently or more quickly to mitigate the spread of coronavirus, in your opinion?
I wrote an article actually this weekend in the Jerusalem Post talking about how we really are leading in terms of how we've responded to it. We were the first country to really close our borders quite quickly, to stop flights coming in from the east, and then we stopped flights coming in from the west, and then we started limiting gatherings from 5,000 to 1,000 to 100 to 10. So we've been doing that all along, I think, very well. When you look at countries like the UK and the US, you're about a month behind Israel in terms of everything that we've done. So on the one hand, I think we've been very good. On the other hand, especially in terms of the ultra-Orthodox community and the leadership and trying to get the message out, we could have done better, but I still think we haven't done a bad job. I just read this evening the Interior Minister saying that during Pesach, the week of Pesach, is when, I think it makes sense actually, is when there might be a full lockdown, because people would have been on holiday anyway. So I think if you're going to do it, this is the time to do it. We'll have to put up with our families a little bit more, but ultimately I think it's the best thing to do. You can always do things better. I honestly think that the Prime Minister's done a fantastic job in terrible circumstances in the middle of an election. He really kept his eye on the ball, and he steered the country, you know, in the circumstances quite well. Gidon?
Well, I don't know how much I can add to somebody who's written an article in the newspaper about this, but if I could just pick up another topic, and that is, like you said, the tragic situation that the ultra-Orthodox are in, and we'll soon see them even more. I mentioned before people came into the program that my brother lives in Muncie, which is an ultra-Orthodox community in the United States, in New York, and things are just going absolutely haywire over there, just incomprehensible what's going on there, and people are not even understanding how terrible the situation is. They're seeing the death announcements of their friends and their even their family, but they're still not getting the idea that we really have to stay inside. And I think that this is going to possibly make a big difference about how the ultra-Orthodox in general as a social category will move and change after this is all done. I think that they will be a lot more involved with general society. I'm talking about Israel, and I think that will ultimately we'll be able to see some benefit coming out of this after the tragedies that we are certainly going to be seeing.
Very well said. Yeah, it's gonna change things, I think, for sure. And then finally, I just want to end off this final question here. It's very fitting. I know a lot of members of my group care deeply about this, which is that how can we help from the outside? How can the United States citizens help Israel and help Israelis deal with the coronavirus? Is there anything we can do from over here in the States that we can help our brothers and sisters in Israel?
Fleur, since I know that you've got a great answer for this, let me just give a little short one. And that is that what you guys are doing now, and really I want to thank Benji for, all of us, I'm sure, are grateful for Benji for hosting this kind of opportunity. And I know that my inbox is full of Zoom meetings, and I think that this is once again an opportunity for people to focus a little bit more on Israel. I think that if each and every one of you, I think I'll be bursting into an open door by saying, participate more in Israel-based activities. I think the fact that now all of our activities are through Zoom, make sure that you participate in at least one Zoom activity a week. If there's nothing that interests you, then reach out to somebody on Facebook and let's have a real Zoom meeting one-on-one, and that will get you closer to Israel. And the opportunities that Fleur Fleur will say in a moment, will be there. But if you're going to be more focused on Israel, that because it's very easy not to be focused on Israel when you don't even have enough toilet paper. But it's important to stay focused on Israel, and I'm sure that my colleagues here join me on with our gratitude for your people taking time out to think about Israel and to be so positive about Israel in this time as well.
Well, I agree with everything Gidon said. I have a practical way that people can help. Benji, I've just sent you a link for an organization that is basically just providing food packages for the needy. I really don't know how to share it on your thing. I'm very technologically not very advanced.
I'll see what I can do.
But I've sent it to your WhatsApp, and if you want to share it, it's a fantastic cause. It's an organization that basically takes youth at risk and turns them into volunteers, and then in turn turns them into upright and contributing citizens, which is a wonderful thing. And this is the organization that's working with the municipality for everybody, for Jews and Arabs alike, to bring people basic needs, food packages, diapers, anything that they need. I'm working very closely with them. And anybody who has a spare $50, $100, whatever they want to do, everything helps. And so we're very, very grateful for anything that you can do. Thank you.
I've just shared that on the group chat, so everybody should look onto the group chat and you'll see those links.
Thank you very much, Fleur. Thank you for that. That's great, and I'll definitely post it also on our Dallas Jewish Conservatives groups. A lot of our members would love to contribute and to help with that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the time, everyone. Taking a little bit out of your day to learn more about the Israeli political scene and what's happening on the ground in Israel and Jerusalem. Thank you to Fleur, Jeremy, Gidon. I really appreciate it. We'll have to have you back. Hopefully one day I can come visit you all and see you, not through a Zoom camera.
So, well, welcome to Dallas.
Yeah, you're welcome anytime. And thank you all for all the attendees, everyone that participated. We recorded this, so we'll be posting it also later for everyone to enjoy in case they missed it, in case they want to check it out later. And did want to make a quick announcement. Our next event, already got it scheduled. We have the China threat and the future of our nation. Obviously, extremely fitting topic, very timely, of course. We have the great Frank Gaffney. If you haven't heard of him, please look him up. He is the advisor. He was the advisor for Ronald Reagan, Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy. Great guy. Actually is a local Dallas guy, and knows everything on the subject. So get your questions ready. That's going to be on Sunday, April 12th at 1 p.m. And it's going to also be through Zoom and Facebook Live. Make sure you register at the link below, which I will also put on our website and also is on the Facebook group. And everyone have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much, and happy Passover.
Happy Passover.
Take care.